Discretion is advised. This is 10-Minute Murder.
Once they're in custody, it's common for criminals to begin confessing to multiple crimes, often including murders that they didn't commit, or imaginary killings that never even took place. Sometimes it's an attempt to get a shorter prison sentence, somehow, or a better plea bargain. But on other occasions, it's a violent criminal's last chance to exert power over others by leading authorities on a wild goose chase. But when Samuel Little was convicted of murder, the FBI spent the next 3 years seeing if any unsolved cases could be linked to him, and what they found didn't even scratch the surface. They only found out the true extent of Samuel's crimes when he began to confess to a dizzying number of murders, totaling almost 100 kills in more than 3 decades. He was confessing in the hope that he would be transferred to a different prison, but investigators quickly realized that Samuel didn't seem to be lying. One by one, they fact-checked the details that Samuel gave them. It all lined up. They hadn't just caught a murderer, they'd caught one of the most prolific serial killers in the history of the United States. But why spend so much time chasing down the victims of a man already spending the rest of his life in prison? Christy Palazzolo, a crime analyst for the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, described why it was so important to track down as many of Samuel's victims as possible. For many years, Christy said, Samuel Little believed he would not be caught because he thought no one was accounting for his victims. Even though he is already in prison, the FBI believes it's important to seek justice for each victim, to close every case possible. By the age of 16, Samuel already had a criminal record. He was caught breaking and entering in 1956. Long before his first day in juvenile detention, he had been a troubled child. The details of his early life are fuzzy, and all the authorities have to go on is what Samuel himself believed about his upbringing. He told investigators that his mother, Bessie, had been a teenage prostitute. From the details investigators were able to find about Bessie, they came to believe that Samuel might have been born while Bessie was in prison. The first time Samuel fantasized about choking and strangling women, he was 5 or 6 years old. One day, he saw his kindergarten teacher touching her own neck, and he immediately began to imagine strangling her. From then on, he was obsessed. In his teenage years, he started a collection of true crime newspapers and magazines, but only the issues containing stories about women being strangled. Samuel's behavioral issues escalated as he aged, and by the time he was incarcerated at 16 years of age, he was at a breaking point. From then on, he hopped between different jobs, moving from state to state. The more times he relocated, the longer the list of crimes that followed him: fraud, armed robbery, shoplifting, assault, and rape. By early 1975, he had been arrested in 11 different states on 26 separate occasions. In 1982, Samuel was arrested yet another time, and this time his arrest was in Mississippi, where he was suspected of murdering Melinda Rose LaPree, a 22-year-old woman who had recently gone missing. Even though Samuel wasn't indicted for Melinda's murder, he was extradited back to Florida during the investigation to be tried for a different murder. Patricia Ann Mount was a 26-year-old woman who had been killed by an unknown assailant, and her remains had been found in September 1982, the same month that Melinda LaPree had disappeared. In court, Samuel was positively identified by witnesses who had seen him with Patricia on the day that she went missing. However, the testimonies were ruled to be untrustworthy. Shortly after being acquitted for Patricia's murder, Samuel moved to San Diego. He kidnapped and strangled another young woman who managed to survive the attack, leading to Samuel being arrested once again. Less than a month later, police found Samuel with a badly beaten and unconscious woman in the backseat of his car. He'd carried out the attack in the exact location where he'd tried to kill his last victim. For both attempted murders, he was sentenced to less than 3 years of jail time. Straight after his release, he moved to LA and killed 10 more women. The arrests weren't stopping him. They were just slowing him down a little bit. Despite the fact that Samuel wasn't stopping, the next arrest came decades later, in late 2012. At first, he only faced charges related to narcotics, but technology had advanced since the last time that Samuel spent time behind bars. Through DNA testing, he was connected to 3 unsolved murders that had taken place in Los Angeles during the 1980s. The first murder was that of Carol Alford, a 41-year-old woman who had been killed in July of 1987. Her half-naked body was found dumped in an alleyway after she was strangled to death. DNA samples were collected from under her fingernails, where she had scratched at her attacker's skin, as well as from her underwear. Both samples were a match to the same man, Samuel Little. The second woman, 46-year-old Guadalupe Apodaca, had been strangled to death and sexually assaulted before her body was left in an abandoned shop. Samuel's third suspected victim was 35-year-old Audrey Everett. She had been strangled, beaten, and dragged across the ground before her body was left in an LA dumpster in August of 1989. Her beating had been so severe that her spine had been smashed, and the coroner described her injuries as showing a degree of force that was the greatest that he had seen in a 27-year practice, in a county which has its share of strangulation cases. The more that investigators looked into Samuel Little's life, the more crimes they suspected he had been involved in. Within 2 months, California police announced that Samuel was now believed to be involved in more than 30 murders. There were some similarities. Most of his victims were women of lower socioeconomic status, and there was proof that most had been strangled to death. However, Samuel didn't seem to discriminate by age. He had picked up his victims in a wide array of locations before disposing of their bodies in abandoned buildings, bodies of water, secluded roads, vacant houses, or empty fields. In September of 2014, Samuel went to trial for the murders of Linda Alford, Guadalupe Apodaca, and Audrey Everett, who were all killed between July 1987 and August 1989. With a combination of reliable witnesses and DNA matches found at the scenes of the crimes, he was found guilty, receiving a sentence of life in prison without parole. During the sentencing, Samuel insisted that he was innocent, but only just a few years later, his story of innocence began to change. In 2018, the confessions began, and they kept coming. By November of 2018, Texas sheriffs announced that Samuel had credibly confessed or been linked to over 90 murders, which took place over 35 years in 14 different states. Despite giving incredibly detailed descriptions of his victims and their deaths, where he seemed to particularly enjoy describing how attractive he had found the women he killed, there was only enough evidence to charge him with 5 additional murders. In total, he was only ever convicted of murdering 8 of the women he confessed to killing. During his confessions, Samuel explained how he picked his victims, how he chose women who were on the outskirts of society, women who were living on the streets, addicted to hard drugs, or forced to work as prostitutes. They weren't crimes of opportunity for Samuel. Instead, he was cherry-picking women who he believed that nobody would miss. He believed that by selecting his victims in this way, he was making it harder for authorities to track him down, or even identify that the women were victims of a serial killer. Tragically, he was right. He was only identified as a serial offender after his arrest, and most of his murders were written off as being isolated incidents. On the 27th of November 2018, the FBI made an announcement. They had been working on confirming Samuel's confessions by matching the details to missing persons cases and unsolved deaths. So far, they had been able to verify 34 confessions he had made, but their job was far from done, with more than 50 unverified confessions still remaining. And that's the end of part 1 of Samuel Little, the Choke and Stroke Killer on 10 Minute Murder. Now, I could have stopped right there. That could have been the entire episode in itself. However, in part 2, you're going to hear from Samuel Little himself because, like I said, the confessions didn't stop. he kept confessing to so many things, and these confessions were recorded. He also gave interviews. So in the next episode, you're going to hear from Samuel Little himself. And by the way, before we get started with that, if you are new to 10 Minute Murder, hit subscribe right now so that you can continue listening. It's not that you couldn't continue listening if you don't subscribe. It makes it easier to continue listening if you are a subscriber. If you've got story suggestions or just want to reach out to me, joe@10minutemurder.com is my email address. All right, on to part 2.